Hello, friends, and welcome once again to the Gospel of Matthew, our four-part September of 2020 series of Christian formation classes for the Church of the Good Shepherd. It has been a real pleasure to reread through the Gospel of Matthew with all of you, and glad to get going on the fourth part of our series tonight. I thought that maybe tonight what we would do is start with a prayer, and then I will give a bit of a presentation on a couple of important aspects of these last seven or eight chapters of Matthew's Gospel. And then we'll spend the rest of the time just opening it up to talk about your experience of these last few chapters and of your experience of rereading Matthew in general, and open it up to whatever questions remain and whatever else you want to chat about. Does that sound good? Okay.
Totally.
Great. Well, we'll start with a reading and a prayer. This is a reading from the Gospel according to Matthew, and it will sound familiar, especially to those of you who were just racing to the finish line to finish the reading. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." Let us pray. Almighty God, you sent your Son, Jesus Christ, to reconcile the world to yourself. We praise and bless you for those whom you have sent in the power of the Spirit to preach the gospel to all nations. We thank you that in all parts of the earth, a community of love has been gathered together by their prayers and labors, and that in every place your servants call upon your name. For the kingdom and the power and the glory are yours forever. Amen. Okay, so the plan was for 7 chapters a week, and that meant that this week was chapters 22 through 28. I do want to back up and kind of start with chapter 21 because that's such a logical breaking place. That is the part where Jesus rides into Jerusalem in what we now celebrate as Palm Sunday at the beginning of Holy Week. It is worth noting, though, that there are no palms in Matthew's gospel. There are branches that the people cut from the trees. It's a little bit like how there are no shepherds in Matthew either. You read it again and you go, oh, that comes from somewhere else. Oh, okay. So the palm procession, it's also not necessarily a Sunday. We have come to observe Holy Week as being a Sunday to a Saturday, but it doesn't really say here. And it is immediately preceded in chapter 20 by the healing of 2 blind men who call Jesus Son of David. This is turning a corner in the narrative. We are heading into clearing the temple and cursing the fig tree. But first, that cry, Son of David, that prophetic statement of who will sit on the throne of Israel, is picked up by the multitudes as they welcome Jesus riding into town on a donkey. So in the rest of chapter 21, we have Jesus' actions upon arriving in Jerusalem. Immediately after arriving, he goes to the temple and he overturns the tables of the money changers. He calls them a den of robbers. And then after that, he curses a fig tree. He goes to the fig tree and there's no fruit on it. And he says, "May no fruit ever come from you again." And immediately it withers. Very strange story. So first, I just want to open it up for, let me put it this way. I'm going to put you on the spot if you're willing to be put on the spot. If someone who was totally unfamiliar with the Christian faith came to you and asked, first of all, why did Jesus stage this protest in the temple? What would be your answer? How would you explain that?
That they were putting money and business before God.
Okay. Any others? Yeah, Meg?
The fact that the lame and the blind and anybody who was not physically, perfect was not able to enter the temple, And after they're all booted out, Jesus brings them in and heals them.
Okay. Others? Okay. And I'll also ask the question then, why does he curse the fig tree? Explain that to someone who's unfamiliar with the story.
I'd say skip over for the one.
We lost you there, KJ. You froze up for a minute.
Oh, sorry. I'd say skip over that one. I can't figure that one out.
Okay. Anyone want to try? Yeah, Mary?
I thought maybe the fig tree was symbolic.
Okay.
Symbolic for the fact that that his people, Jerusalem, they were not giving him good fruit.
Okay.
And that that's and that there wasn't good fruit in the temple, and that it would wither and die also.
Okay.
And he moved to the temple and
Right. And other explanations? Yeah, Billy and then Bruce.
It could be a reference to his followers
How so?
and to them to produce fruit.
Okay. And Bruce?
This is just an observation, but it would have been just as easy for him to perform a miracle so that the fruit appeared extraordinary, just like that. But it
True.
did. So I think there has to be something quite significant in the fact that he did it this way instead of that way.
Yeah. Okay, good. So I've asked for all this input just because these are two incidents that we don't have solid explanations of. And I notice you all produced different answers. There is no one consensus for why Jesus cleared out the temple, but there are all sorts of explanations that people have offered over the years, and not all of them are completely fair. Meg, your question about bringing the lame and the physically imperfect in, I'm not sure where that comes from because I'm not aware of that interpretation, and I'm willing to learn if you happen to know. The idea of putting business above God's interests, that seems logical, but the point is that Jesus never actually says, he never specifically says, this is the reason I'm doing this. He just does it. And he calls them a den of robbers. And so we're left with that. We're left with a living parable, if you will, that we then get to turn over and over. It's the same with the fig tree. I actually think the fig tree might be a little easier to explain as a symbolic thing. Certainly figs were symbolic of Jerusalem and of the presence of God in the temple. I've read that. So he curses the fig tree, and there is a connection here with the temple in some way. So I'll just let that be. But there are definitely two things I really want to focus on in my part of the talk tonight. Two big issues that are interrelated. One is the effect on Matthew's gospel of the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. And every Christian should learn what year that happened. Anybody know? Tell me.
AD 70.
70, that's exactly right. You know, if you're an American, then you know 1776, right? If you're a Christian, you should know 70. And the reason is that, as I love to repeat, and you've probably heard me say, the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in 70 is the most important event in the Bible that is not recorded anywhere in the Bible, because at least Matthew, Luke, and John are written in the shadow of that event. And we think that Mark was written around the time of that event, either immediately before or immediately after, somewhere in that range. It was really a period of several years, 68 to 70, when the Romans were systematically destroying Jerusalem. But the temple itself was destroyed in 70. And in a way, you'd have to ask a Jewish scholar to confirm this for me, but I have heard it said that that was really, in a way, the end of Judaism and then the beginning of Judaism. That this was the closest the religion came to being stamped out, and that it had to build itself back up from the ground again after that point. So first, let's talk about the destruction of the temple. Oh, the other issue that's related and that we can't not talk about in Matthew is the unfortunate use of Matthew throughout the centuries for anti-Semitic persecution. And it's really important for Christians to know where are those hot button passages that if we're not careful how we handle them, they can be used to inspire hatred and division. So we're going to talk about that as well tonight. First, we'll talk about the destruction of the temple. So here's our timeline. Jesus dies around the year 30. The Romans destroyed Jerusalem around the year in the year 70. Mark was written between 64 and 72, somewhere around that time. Matthew and Luke were probably written in the 80s. Now, in Matthew 24, chapter 2, which we read for tonight, Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. There are comments about these great stones and how beautiful this is, and Jesus says, I tell you, all will be thrown down, not one stone will be left on another. Now, this is taken directly from Mark's Gospel, chapter 13, verse 2. So this is one of those parts of Mark that Matthew carries forward and uses. We've talked about how that happens. Now, let's talk about this, because as we read the Gospels, we expect them to be faithful representations some decades later of what Jesus really said and did as a human being. Indeed, if the Gospels aren't this, then what good are they? This is what we need them to be. These are our only stories of the man we believe to be the Messiah, the anointed, Emmanuel, God with us. So if we can't trust them to tell the truth, then what's the point? And this is where we wind up in that familiar place where we feel the discomfort of Jesus said some of these things, and some of these other things, perhaps he didn't specifically say. Now, the reason for this is that we know we're looking in Matthew's gospel at something seen through the memory of the destruction of the temple, in very recent memory. It can't be escaped that Matthew is writing this with that recent memory in mind. Now, that does not mean that he's not quoting Jesus word for word. He might be. But we have to reckon with the fact that it's being written on the other side. It's being written down on the other side of that event. So partly this is once again about the question, what is the Bible and what is it for? If we expect it to be a newspaper, we're probably going to be disappointed at times. Matthew's gospel, written after the destruction of the temple, in the shadow of that event, this is what we have to deal with. Now, we can also extrapolate from context that Matthew's community, as we talked about before, was in a contentious relationship with local synagogues. Again, Rabbinic Judaism was just trying to find its ground again in the first couple decades after the destruction of the temple. And suddenly it found itself in competition with one of its own sects, the Jewish Christians. What were Jews going to be going forward? Were they going to have to embrace Jesus as the Messiah? There were those who did not believe that. What was going to happen? And so you have two different versions of Judaism trying to figure out which one was going to be the dominant one from a position of almost having been completely destroyed. So here are two good reasons not to doubt that Jesus actually predicted the destruction of the temple. The number one reason is one that we all know. Hey, divinity, right? Jesus is God incarnate. That's a good reason. The second reason is that even among those who are not God incarnate, there are many very astute people who pay attention, people who are able to announce decades in advance what is likely to happen politically given certain conditions. It may have been really clear to Jesus in the year 2930 that it wasn't going to be long before this temple wasn't here anymore. And indeed, this is what all the biblical prophets did. They spoke about what was likely to come to pass based on their very clear sight and their understanding through their relationship with God, the Spirit speaking through them. So if you like, Jesus did speak all these words and Matthew quoted them. Or if you like, Matthew read back into Jesus' mouth the events that had unfolded because he found them to be directly in keeping with what Jesus had always talked about. We have room in the church for a breadth of understandings and beliefs about Jesus. So it doesn't bother me, whichever way people look at this. So the other issue that I want to talk about is the issue of the destruction of the temple and how that relates to the use of Matthew's gospel, the misuse of Matthew's gospel over the centuries. Just in the section that we look at, we've read for tonight, I want to point out some things. In chapter 21, verses 33 and following, we have the parable of the vineyard tenants. Incidentally, that is the gospel for this Sunday. Oh, but Christopher, I see your hand up. I think you want to, yes.
Yes. Do we have any understanding why the Romans decided to sack the temple? I mean, it had been sacked hundreds of years before after Solomon built it, and then it was rebuilt when they came out of exile. So it wasn't nearly as elaborate. So they weren't after materials. Do we know what was going on?
Yes.
As to why
What was going on is that the Jews revolted. That some group of Zionists, Zionists, that's not the right word. I'm sorry, that's a terrible conflation. What's the word I'm looking for? Zealots. That's the other Z word. Some group of the group of zealots who thought that the only way forward was to overthrow Rome, did rise up and try to overthrow Rome and get rid of them. These revolutionaries were around in Jesus' time. In fact, we hear of Simon the Zealot, one of his followers. You could say that they were a group of freedom fighters, or from the Romans' perspective, you could say they were a group of terrorists. Take your pick. But their idea was to throw the Romans out and make Jerusalem into the capital of a Jewish nation again. That didn't happen. The Roman army was far too powerful. So that's what was going on in that time. And then there were other revolts later, like the Bar Kokhba revolt in the next century, which also failed spectacularly. So yeah, that's the setting there. Yes, Christopher, you're still on mute.
were a lot of the Jews killed at that point too?
Yes.
Or was it just?
Yeah, many.
It really was almost a genocide, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm no historian, and I try to be careful applying that word in situations where I don't know whether it belongs. But certainly what we're looking at is the Romans deciding that the Jews had gotten too big for their britches here, and they were going to teach them a lesson, and completely destroy the center of their religion. Yeah. So the city was completely destroyed. So when you look at the parable of the vineyard tenants, from Jesus' perspective, he's saying to the Pharisees, the kingdom will be taken away from them and it will be given to those who bear fruit. This is in response to his question to the Pharisees. You know, if you've got this situation where these tenants are supposed to be taking care of the vineyard, but instead they kill the heir to try to get the fortune, which, by the way, makes literally no sense. I mean, how would that get you the fortune? You must think that the landlord is really, really distant and never coming back or something. But he sends his son, they kill him. And then Jesus asks the Pharisees, well, what should the owner of the vineyard do? And they say, well, he should destroy them. He should put an end to them. And it's at that point that Jesus says, the kingdom is going to be taken away from you and given to people who bear fruit. This is dangerous, right? The way that we interpret this matters, and the way that we interpret this for subsequent generations matters. In the next chapter, in the wedding feast parable, there's a very strange turn of events. In fact, I'm going to turn to it here. There's a verse that only appears in Matthew's version of the story. I'm going to read the wedding banquet parable, the beginning of Matthew 22. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet. But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. Now listen to this verse. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Matthew's the only one who inserts that verse. It's like the king's getting ready for this banquet, but all of a sudden everything's going to stop while the king goes and massacres all these people. And then he'll pick up again with the wedding preparations. It's very strange. And it's hard not to interpret that as a reading of the destruction of the temple back into the parable, which only Matthew does in his version of the parable. In chapter 23, we have a whole chapter of Jesus just attacking the Pharisees. All these woe to you, woe to you, woe to you, this ongoing screed against those in positions of power who make hypocritical excuses for their behavior. And then chapter 24 gets downright eschatological. And Matthew 25 is a series of 3 eschatological parables. Now, I'm going to reserve too much comment on those 2 chapters because I'm sure that I will get back to them again when we do a series in November on Christian eschatology in particular. The plan is to call the series The Christian Hope, Falling Apart and Drawing Together. And I want to talk about all that eschatological language, including in the Gospels. But you see that the moment Jesus enters Jerusalem, everything starts to get very dire, and more so. And then after all that, we have the beginning of the crucifixion narrative in chapter 26 and following. We should also note in chapter 26, in the series of events that I know we're all familiar with around Jesus' crucifixion, the role of Judas has been used ever since as an anti-Semitic trope, with stereotypes, associations about money grubbing, about disloyalty, etc. And in many Christian depictions of the Last Supper in art, Judas is specifically painted to look more Jewish. They paint him with darker skin, they paint him with a hook nose. I remember one such art installation at St. Mark's Cathedral that was in the Loeffler House living room for decades. They've since removed it out of a recognition that it was perpetuating this harmful stereotype. In chapter 27, verse 25, this is another verse that's unique to Matthew. Those assembled before Pilate take responsibility for Jesus' death. When Pilate tries to let Jesus off the hook, the crowd shouts, "Crucify him," as we're familiar with, and Matthew adds this verse that they cry out, "His blood be on us and on our children."
Yep.
Now, again, since this is unique to Matthew, it may be more likely to be Matthew's own creation. And indeed, the next generation was the generation that saw the temple destroyed and Jerusalem overrun. And thousands of Jews, as Christopher was asking about, thousands of Jews were killed or exiled. So the next generation did indeed bear the brunt of Roman aggression before Matthew wrote all this down. But ever since, anti-Semitic groups have used this verse to argue that continued persecution of Jews is justifiable for all time. His blood be on us and on our children, the implication being in perpetuity, which certainly was not what Matthew intended. He was just dealing with his own thing in his own time. And then finally, in chapter 28, there's the story that's also unique to Matthew, that a story spreads around that Jesus' followers stole his body from the tomb. There's no explanation about how they get past the guards. There's no explanation about how they roll the stone away or anything. There's just a story that goes around that's supposed to explain away the resurrection. So all of that is there and has been really terribly used over the years. But there's another important piece here that's theological. It might not be illogical to assume for a moment, let's just stop for a moment and imagine that what's going on here, let's assume wrongly that Jesus didn't see himself as a Jew, that he intended all along to replace Judaism with Christianity. The word for that theologically is supersessionism. That let's imagine that his message is that God has revoked the divine promises to Israel, taken them away, and furthermore that he curses Israel forever and always for unfaithfulness and unbelief. The project of Abraham is over, to be replaced with the Jesus project. What would that say about this God we worship? What would that mean? Oh my gosh, if God revoked promises to the Jews, maybe God would revoke promises to us.
Exactly.
Maybe God is unfaithful. You see how there's a theological conundrum here. Hi, Darren, welcome. If the conundrum here is that if God revokes promises from Israel, then God is not faithful and God might revoke promises from anyone. That means God is untrustworthy. Logically, a God I worship That can't be right. And so we have to be careful how we look at this. How do we look at the relationship of God to Israel in light of Jesus? Does God make promises and then go back on them? And after all the agonized history of the people of Israel and the Hebrew scriptures, God calling them back again, pleading, raging, always invested in the people, would God just give up and move on to someone else? And if so, then why would God show up as a Jew? So, yeah. Supersessionism, I want to posit, is a lazy reading of the Gospels. But it's one that many Christians hold without ever really examining it. Jesus was a Jew and remained so all his life. He didn't come to replace Judaism, but to help place it in a larger worldwide context. He came to remind his people that the chosen people were never meant to be the only people who mattered, but a blessing to all the peoples of the world. Christians living in Matthew's time came to understand that Jesus had not come to replace the Jews. They themselves were Jews. Jesus had come to replace the temple. Not the Jews, but the temple. The temple was going away anyway. Now, another trap that I myself once fell into and got called out for blogging about this by a Jewish Christian historian, or historian of things Jewish and Christian, is that I was under the mistaken impression that Jesus didn't like the temple, that Jesus found fault with the whole system of temple sacrifice, that he thought the whole thing was a terrible racket. And he corrected me on that. I think the issue here with Jesus overturning the tables of the money changers is that Jesus loved the temple so much that he couldn't stand to see it being put to what he deemed to be an unholy use. This was a protest against the powers that be and about their misuse of the power, of them just having the power to have the power and not sharing. And chapter 23 really goes into detail. If you want an explanation for why Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers, just read Matthew chapter 23. Those are his gripes. So Matthew's people came to understand that Jesus came not to replace the Jews, but the temple. And we should also point out that if you want a second opinion on this, Paul writes about this quite eloquently in the letter to the Romans. In chapters 9 through 11, he writes as a Jew to the Christians in Rome, imagining a larger Judaism. Now, that's not to say there's not disagreement. Of course there's disagreement. Was Jesus the Messiah? That's the fundamental disagreement. What are we going to do about that? Well, we're going to disagree. That's fine. But what we're not going to do is persecute those who disagree. And I think that's really important. So how does this look for us today? What does it say about Christians and Jews in relationship with one another? Well, I would posit that it means you don't have to become a Christian to be God's beloved. If that were the case, God didn't have any beloved until after the Gospels were written, right? We can learn much wisdom from one another's traditions. Being a Christian isn't about getting it right. It's about loving beyond our accustomed boundaries. Loving beyond our accustomed boundaries. So to whatever degree you're pushing the envelope with yourself about who is worth loving, to whatever degree your Christian community is pushing the envelope on who is worth loving, we are growing in faith. Now, Christians aren't the only ones who do this. Indeed, people from other religions often find themselves able to expand and embrace the witness of other religions more easily than we do. And we can learn a lot from them. All of that really leads us to the very end, to Matthew 28. And I'll close with this bit, and then we'll really open it up for conversation about what you read. The Great Commission is at the end of Matthew 28. I read it at the beginning of this session. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. I love these words. Let's look at them a little more closely. Go make disciples of all nations. Now, you can take this to mean that the project is to eventually baptize literally everybody on earth, or you might not. It might just be that the project is baptize all those who are willing, share the good news, and baptize those who want to join this movement. There is no mention here of God disapproving when baptisms don't happen, when people do not become Christians. That's not here. Baptism is a sign and a sacrament of God's grace, and God's grace is mediated through it. But God's grace is mediated through many other channels as well. So we don't need to worry about those who are not baptized as if they were outside of the reach of God's grace. It's worth noting that the Great Commission is the only specific invocation of the Trinity in the entire Bible. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This is where it begins. The dogmas about the Trinity wouldn't coalesce until centuries later, but this is the beginning. Jesus says, obey everything that I have commanded you. In other words, what did Jesus command us? Love one another. Love, 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 love. Teach love. Teach people how to love. You don't need to teach some obscure list of membership requirements. When people want to become Christians, that's wonderful. Come on board. When people don't, we love them. So our mission is to all the people of the world. And yes, we baptize them. But where people don't want to be baptized, we don't persecute them. We love them. Love is more important than baptism. So that's where I want to stop for now and open it up and hear what you're thinking. We have ample time to talk about what you read and any other thoughts that you have on the entire Gospel of Matthew over the next 45 minutes.
Josh, will you tell me what that verse is that you just spoke of? I had to leave the room for a minute.
Oh, sure. The Great Commission at the very end of Matthew's Gospel, at the end of Matthew 28.
Thank you.
Sure. Starting with verse 16 there. Okay.
That's very helpful what you said, actually. I want to talk to some people about this.
Well, we've built up quite an awful reputation for ourselves as Christians for being intolerant and hateful, and we need to be the people who work against that, not just by being quiet, but by actively opposing such things. Other thoughts?
It's me.
Darren. Yeah, hi, Darren.
I would like to hear what folks think about the word disciple in that commission. Because for me, disciple is this relationship with the living teacher. And then once he ascends, the disciples become apostles. And so there's this shift and but then we're out there being disciples, which is back to the living master concept. So where are we at with what discipleship means?
Okay, very good. The way I've always heard it is that a disciple is one who follows a teacher, and an apostle is one who then goes on to lead others to become disciples. So you turn around and become an apostle, and then you have more work to do. The apostles will go and make disciples of all nations. And by nations, we need to remember that we're talking about ethnic groups. That's what nations really means in that context. There were no nation states in the way that we think of them. Other peoples, other traditions, other practices, other cultures are all to be told this message and taught this message, and invited to be baptized and join in this project of worldwide love through Jesus, right? Other thoughts on disciple, apostle? Okay, good. Thank you, Darren. Yeah, Christopher.
The slumber party in the Gethsemane.
Yeah.
When I read it this time, it was the first time it hit me that it was 3 times that the guys dozed off.
Yep.
And yet it seems incongruous that here they were in the power and presence of the Son of God, the Messiah, and yet they couldn't stay awake. What's your take on that? What's the importance of that for us today?
Thank you. The first thing I think about is that Christy and I have a a practice of watching TV or watching movies in the evening, but we're very used to me falling asleep and then picking it up the next night. Sometimes it takes us 2 or 3 nights to get through a movie because I can't stay awake. She has no problem with it. So I can relate to the disciples in this case. Even I'm loving this movie, but I can't keep my eyes open. Yeah, stay awake. You can read this literally as Jesus gets aggravated with them because they don't seem to recognize the import of what's going on here. And the 3 times is certainly a very symbolic number. We've also got Peter's going to deny him 3 times before the cock crows. That's the last thing that happens before that. But stay awake is something Jesus has been saying. He said it in the little apocalypse just a little bit earlier. That stay awake. You don't know the hour. You don't know the time. I think that what Jesus wants his followers to understand, and certainly what Matthew wants his followers to understand in his own time, is that you don't know what's happening next in life. You don't know what's coming next. Don't doze off. You don't know when your opportunity is to live in sync with God. That can happen at any time. And then we'll talk when we talk about eschatology about what stay awake means in that context, or might mean in that context. But verse 41 here, stay awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Of course, that's where we get that phrase. Other thoughts on that?
I think that phrase has been used against people,
How so?
The
Go ahead.
The spirit is willing and the flesh is weak, like to guilt people out, like if they're sick or mentally ill or something like that. And, well, I've felt it, I've tried to fast or whatever, but I failed. It's kind of, I don't know. I kind of think I know what it means, but also I think it's been used in a weird way sometimes, maybe.
Yeah, maybe it's probably safer to apply it to yourself rather than others, right? Yeah. Mary, I saw your hand up.
That's what I was going to say. In my own life, I think I fall asleep when I don't see the goodness in other people, or I miss an intention and I make my own up. It's like I'm asleep to who the other person is. And so those are, I think when I'm not loving enough or loving in the way Christ would have me be, then I feel like I'm asleep. And yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's really perceptive, Mary. I think about how it applies to my own personality. And I think that the times when I'm asleep, what I've noticed in the last decade or so of my life, is when I'm in a hurry to get something done and I need something from somebody and I'm writing an email, I'm zipping it off without really reading very carefully. And you know what I'm going to miss? I'm going to miss how the other person is feeling. It might be dripping off the words of the email I'm replying to, but all I can think in the moment is, got to get this done, got to get this done. That's when I'm asleep. And I've noticed that when I don't get enough rest, when I don't get enough quiet time in my life, then I'm far more likely to act like that and to tick somebody off, or put somebody out, because I wasn't paying attention to the feelings that were way more important in that moment than whatever task I thought was so important. Yeah. So that's how it manifests for me. Others? Or other questions? Yeah, Darren.
I feel like I noticed a grace thing showing up in this too. Like thematically in this gospel, we see Jesus telling the disciples over and over to do things that they end up not being able to do. Like they end up not being able to walk on water and heal paralytics. And like, it's another situation where like they let him down, but importantly, we never see him go to a punitive stance.
No.
He's never like, you fell asleep, you're out.
Right. Exactly.
And so I think it's like that idea that like, even for all of us, like we mess up, we just do. It's just it's just worked into the casserole. Like,
Yeah.
Try it again. You fell
Right.
asleep. I'm going away to try again. Try it again.
Right. I'm your teacher. Okay. I just observe. You didn't do that right. Okay. I'm just observing that. That's for your knowledge. That's for your growth. You fell asleep. Oh, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Oh, you're still taking your rest. Okay. Well, you missed this chance. Here comes my accuser right now. On we go. I'm reading a book right now. Oh my gosh, I'm going to be raving about this book. I hope this isn't too much of a tangent. I'm just going to put it out there. It's written by one of my seminary classmates. It just came out. It's called The Beautiful Letdown by David Tremaine. An addict's theology of addiction. So he's writing as an addict in recovery. And it's a whole theology about that is just mind-blowing. And it kind of speaks to some of this. Darren, you made a reference that made me think about how it's in the doing it wrong where there is grace. It's in the messing up, that it's in the chaos of our lives. That's where God meets us. God doesn't wait to meet us until our lives are all in order and static, because that'll never happen anyway. It's when we're at our absolute worst that grace is operating full force. So that's what that makes me think of. And this book proposes that the opposite of chaos is not order. The opposite of chaos is engagement. You've either got unbridled chaos with no relationship, which leads to violence and destruction and horror, or you've got chaos in relationship, which is when you get temporary balance and then off kilter and nope, got to do this over here and spinning plates. And that's what life is really like, even when it's at its most joyful. Not when we're necessarily at our most content, because that can get boring, but when we're actively engaging and learning and growing and failing and trying again. Billy, I saw your hand a moment ago.
Yes. The lesson I take away from the disciples is they were human, and yet they were in Jesus's inner circle. So that gives me hope for my own journey.
Mm-hmm. Yep. These weren't outstanding people. Sometimes I think Jesus called the first 12 people he ran into. Honestly, it's like, well, he's walking along the seashore. Well, I guess this is where I start. I'll just call some people. He gets these 12 random dudes, and then whoever else wants to follow along, whoever's willing to go along, and he's got this sort of entourage of just these regular folks. And then it turns out that there are these people with this immense variety of life experience. I mean, you've got your several fishermen that are sort of the core. And he says, well, okay, we're going to do some fishing together. But then you've got this tax collector, and you've got this, Judas, who seems to be this especially fastidious type, about keeping the faith and doing it right. Then you've got this zealot named Simon, who's all ready to overthrow the Romans, and just people from all different walks of life. And this is the first time I've thought of it, but maybe they were just the first people he ran into. Maybe any of them would have done. And then by the end of their lives, they're doing these amazing things because of being in direct relationship with their creator. They're transformed. Yeah, Elisa.
I once participated in a discussion with we talked about how what a long day that was for everybody. I mean, they'd start early in the morning, and they had to find a place to have the dinner and have the meal, prepare the meal and all that. And then they have the meal, and that's a long meal that they would have had. And now they are out in the garden at night when, it's been a long day. And of course they're tired. Yeah, and hard to stay awake. And that, we've all been in that kind of situation where it's just like, the spirit is willing to stay. I want to stay awake. I want to be here and pray for you, but I'm so tired I can't even keep my eyes open. And how often we miss things because we've let the busyness of the day get in the way.
Right. Have you ever noticed that the person you love wants to have a deep conversation with you at about 10:30 p.m.
Yes.
And you're like, okay, I want to be in on this, but I can't stay awake.
Uh-huh.
But the other thing that just occurred to me is the disciples may not have been aware that this was a do or die moment here.
Right. Sure.
You know, Jesus just did some weird stuff at that supper. There's this whole a new parable thing about the body and blood, and we don't understand this. And he keeps saying he's going to be killed, and he keeps saying one of you is going to betray me, and he seems really down. And we don't know what this is all about. Well, you know, it's going to do him some good to go pray. We don't understand why he's so down, so we'll go with him, and we just keep trying to learn what he's trying to teach us. And then, all of a sudden, he's being arrested, and now the night's just beginning. It's probably good that they dozed off. All right, other thoughts. Keep them coming. Yeah, Christopher.
We get to the sheep and the goats.
Yes,
and
Matthew 25.
Maybe you'll get to this in another study, but what about the goats? I mean, get out worthless goats, you're good for nothing. That's the message. I thought it was everybody's got a chance at the kingdom.
Mm-hmm. This is it's so binary, isn't it? And it so plays into a theology, you know, rather like the TV show The Good Place. Okay, who's a fan of The Good Place? If you're not, oh my gosh, no other fans of The Good Place. All 4 seasons are now on Netflix. This is the most spectacular show on television because it's all about ethics. And even though it never specifically goes Christian, it definitely goes into places where you can see this is where Christianity picks up and runs with it because there are such good reasons to do so. So The Good Place, I recommend it to you. The premise of The Good Place is that we find out that the afterlife, people's admittance to heaven or to hell, depends on how many points they earned in life or how many points they lost for doing good things or bad things. Now, the reason that they set this up for the show is, number one, it's perfectly clear that this is a terrible system. That if this is the way life is, oh my gosh, that's so futile. There's a song by They Might Be Giants where they say, we were once so close to heaven, Peter came out and gave us medals, declaring us the nicest of the damned. There's a problem with this theology, and so it's easy to see a problem with the sheep and the goats. I get that. Number one, I don't think we necessarily need to read this parable as saying, this is a blueprint for how the judgment day is going to work, right? I think it's deeper than that. I don't think it's just, here's your cosmology, this is what you have to take, I'm giving it to you. Number two, I do think it's about how incredibly important it is to take care of others and not just to look after ourselves. Matthew 25 often gets quoted by Christians who are especially interested in social justice, who want to call out the injustices in the world, and especially those who perpetrate and perpetuate them when they don't have to, when they have the power to change things, right? Let's see, number one, number two. Number three, there's a book I want to recommend to you all. I've recommended it on a number of occasions, but I seem to have lost my copy. It's called Good Goats. Good Goats. And the subtitle is something like Healing Our Image of God. If you look it up on Amazon or wherever, you'll see a cartoon cover that makes it look like a children's book. And indeed, it is full of illustrations that make it look like a children's book. But it's adult theology written for, you know, I wouldn't call it pop theology. I'd call it accessible theology, written for an adult audience. And there's a story in there. This is written by 3 Roman Catholic authors. I think 2 are related and 1 is an in-law or something. So it's Roman Catholic theology about the sheep and the goats. And they tell a story where there was a group of nuns who were at a conference, and they were reading the story of the sheep and the goats. And I think the speaker at the conference asked them, okay, how many of you have been sheep before, right? How many of you have gone out of your way to take care of others, to visit the sick, visit those in prison, feed people, clothe people? And all of them raised their hands. And then the speaker asked, all right, how many of you have been goats? How many of you have failed to take care of the sick, failed to clothe the naked, failed to feed people? And they all raised their hands. We are all sheep and we are all goats. This is the stark reality we have to start with when approaching this parable. Now, if you're a glass half empty person, you might think, oh, I was a goat once. That means I'm doomed. If you're a glass half full person, you might say, well, I remember when I was a sheep, so I'm all right. But it's not about your ultimate all rightness. When you take this parable and just apply it to today, are you being a sheep or a goat today? I think the point is you have a choice. You can always choose to love. You can always choose to go out of your way to love. Other thoughts on the sheep and the goats? Yeah, Bruce.
Yeah, of course, you probably remember this about Fred Rogers towards the end of his life. You know, he was a Presbyterian minister, and
Yes.
apparently he had been reading this passage, and he asked his wife, do you think I'm a sheep? And of course, her answer was, if anybody was ever a sheep, it would be Fred Rogers. But the point is that people really, really do have some questions and problems with this. It's a very serious issue. It gets one into their whole area of divine justice and what that is exactly. It's a huge issue.
Yep, absolutely. And I'm thinking of a scene in C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle, where there's a scene that very much looks like this, where everyone approaches the lion Aslan as they're entering the new Narnia, and either they look into his eyes and they see absolute love and devotion, in which case they go in this direction, or they look into his eyes and they fear and hate this creature, in which case they step into a shadow and they are never seen again. It's stark and terrifying, but you get the sense that the shadow is a mercy, that these people are being just eliminated. There's no ongoing suffering here. They're just, okay, boom. I mean, that's more merciful than the thought of burning in hell, which is a very, that's more of a Dante thing through the eyes of the Lazarus and the rich man parable. Yeah, it's a real issue. I will note that if you look at the sum total of all of Jesus' parables and all his dealings with people in all four Gospels, this is some wisdom I picked up from Robert Farrar Capon. With Jesus, no one is ever excluded who wasn't first included.
No.
He never uses harsh rhetoric with those who were on the outside.
No.
Only with those self-assured people on the inside who think they've got it all figured out.
Very true.
They think that they've reached this point of stasis where they've got it made. If you ever think you've got it made, you're in big trouble with Jesus. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very true.
Okay. Yeah, Mary.
I just wanted to make a comment on the beginning about the promises that God made to the Jews and to the Israelites.
Yeah.
I don't think of them as promises. They were covenants.
Good. Yeah.
And I think that's different than a promise.
Okay, very good.
And God made covenants with those people, and I think those covenants last forever.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, Jewish people have a covenant with God, and I don't know. So I think that's special for them.
Right, exactly. And maybe it's none of our business as Christians what the details of that covenant are or the living out of it in these days.
Yeah.
Right? We only know that we're supposed to love one another. The word covenant and the concept of covenant is so crucial. And I will point out that when you read the different prophets of the Hebrew scriptures, there were some who theorized that the covenant with Moses was dead and needed to be replaced. That things had gotten so bad that the Jews had broken the covenant so many times that there was no way it could be saved. And that what was needed was for God to institute a new covenant. There were other prophets that said, look, the covenant looks like it's on the ropes. It looks like it's dead, but God is faithful. And this covenant is going to be renewed, and here's how.
Yeah.
The difference is academic, right? How dead is the covenant? The covenant's in trouble either way.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. And I also think of Moses on coming down from the mountain when he comes down to find that Aaron has given in to the urges of the Israelites, and they've created this calf that they're going to worship instead because they've given up on Moses. And God says to Moses, "Stand back. I'm going to destroy them all, and I'm going to start over again with you." At which point Moses says, "Don't do that. That is not in character for you." It's almost like he steps outside of the narrative and he's reading the story and he says, "Oh, that would make a terrible story." Right? So he says to God, "Look, if you do this, then the Egyptians are going to say that you got them out of Egypt just for the purpose of destroying them. It'll make you look cruel when I know that you are loving and steadfast. So don't do this thing," says the human to the creator. It's pretty wonderful.
That's pretty cocky.
Right? And Moses is part of a long tradition of people of Israel arguing with God, and like Abraham was working on in Sodom and Gomorrah, trying to change God's mind about something. Hi, Grace. And so that's when I've studied what I've studied of Judaism, and especially I'm thinking of the class that I took on Midrash. There's a Midrash that I can't remember all the details of right now, but it's a story in which some rabbi says something to contradict what another rabbi said, and then a third rabbi says something to contradict that, and in the end, the story ends with with them challenging God back, and God says, "Ah, this is marvelous. My children have bested me. You are right, and I was wrong."
I love that.
Right? I have to look it up. I don't remember all the details now.
Josh, do you have a book to recommend? You might have already, about Midrash or anything like that, or an article or something. Maybe you could post it later or something like that.
Yeah, I would just say start with Wikipedia, because that's never a bad place to start to go find other things to link to, right? Start there and just look up what Midrash is. But then also just Google around. There are lots of collections of Midrash out there online, and if they look like they come from a reputable source, they probably are. So yeah, that's where I would start.
I just love the whole idea of it.
Yeah, that we have these parallel stories. For those who weren't part of the class that I taught earlier, we talked a little bit in the previous class about Midrash as this Jewish tradition of writing extra stories to lay alongside the biblical story that helped to answer some of the outstanding questions that we still had. And everybody knows these stories were added later, but the point is that there is wisdom in them. Like, for instance, well, why did Cain kill Abel after all? And then there's all this Midrash available from the rabbis. Yeah, Elisa.
I am often intrigued by, in the movie Yentl, about how in the classroom or wherever they're arguing back and forth and sharing different viewpoints and so on, and how exciting that must have been, to be able to share ideas and argue them and learn new things. And
yeah, I haven't seen Yentl since I was a child. I'd love to see it again.
For a long time, but
right.
Yeah.
And of course it's Hollywood, right? So who knows how the representation is? But I always look to Fiddler on the Roof, my own favorite movie about things Jewish, and that I think is held in fairly high esteem by Jewish people. And of course, the better thing to do, the truer thing to do, would be to get to know some folks who are Jewish and learn, well, what is this like, right? Is this a tradition that continues in your place? Yeah, cool.
I had a lovely friend in the science community, and she was Jewish, like I'm Christian, and we just loved each other for that. And it was like somehow we knew we loved the same God, and so it was. I miss her. I should contact her.
There you go. Excellent. It's all about relationships.
Yep. Yeah, but it was that was a lovely thing for the two of us to know each other in that way, to know our hearts in that way.
Bruce.
Anita actually has.
Oh, Anita.
Yeah, I've been thinking about when reading Matthew, little faith and great faith. And it seems like Jesus, when he talked about little faith, he told the disciples several times, you of little faith. But then he met some individuals that the lady from Matthew 15, the lady who came and the daughter was sick. And then the disciples, they even said, she's bothering you. Well, don't let her come and say what she wants to Jesus. And then she's the one that the disciples didn't see that she had great faith. But then Jesus tells her, woman, great is your faith. And they heard that, but to themselves, I just wonder how they experienced. Maybe they thought they had great faith. They followed Jesus. He was the great master. But then they heard him saying to other people, individuals, that they had great faith. And sometimes I just wonder how we look at ourselves sometimes. You know, do we always know if you have little faith or great faith? Can you explain some of that?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the main themes in Matthew, the question of how much faith you have. And, you know, and he says, you know, you've got the mustard seed parable. Faith the size of a mustard seed will make this mountain move from here to here. But then he always seems to be pointing out the people who have great faith. There's also the man who asks for healing for his child, I think, and Jesus says, well, I'll come with you. And he says, no, you don't even need to come. I know that if you just say the word, this will happen, and then I'll go home and it will have been done, because I know you're a busy man. And I'm a busy man. I know what that's like. You've got other people you need to be with. You don't need to go out of your way when I know you could help me just right now. And Jesus says, wow. And this person is not Jewish, right? And Jesus says, I haven't seen this kind of faith in all of Israel. This is a Roman. So he points it out, especially when it's the people you don't expect. Right. When it's the people who are either outsiders or they're outside of the norms of quote unquote acceptability in society. These are the people that he points out how great their faith is. Yeah.
Those are powerful teaching moments for sure.
Yeah, and Anita, I don't know if I have a full answer, but I love your observation that it's good to ask ourselves, to turn that back on ourselves. It's when the disciples are in the boat and they're complaining because they forgot to bring any bread, right? And Jesus says, do you remember what just happened back there? You know, we fed 5,000 people, and how much bread? And then we fed 4,000 more, and how much bread? And you're still worried about bread, right? And then he says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. And they say, oh, it's because we didn't bring any bread. Guys, head desk. Do you have faith? Do you trust me? Do you trust me or not? Faith is trust. Faith is trust. And again, like we pointed out in other places with the staying awake, falling asleep, he doesn't say, okay, that's it. That was your last chance and you don't have enough faith. Leave now. Of course he doesn't say that. He points out when they don't have faith so that they can learn from that and so that they can grow. Yeah.
And so we can too.
Right. Right. The Holy Spirit speaking to us. Right? Yeah. Yeah, Meg. Oh.
I just think it's interesting. It's in chapter 27, verse 19, where Pilate's wife, sends a message saying Jesus is an innocent man. You know, don't have anything to do with this.
Yeah.
And she had a dream. So many places in the Bible, they explain or talk about the dreams. This one is just, she had a dream, and they go on.
Yeah, this is unique to Matthew. It's very, it doesn't seem necessary, right? If you were going to make the movie of the book, would you include Pilate's wife? Why would you? I mean, this doesn't lead anywhere. This doesn't have any specific consequences, apparently. It does call to mind dreams as a hint of what's to come, like Joseph, right? Like either Joseph, the Old Testament Joseph or Jesus' father Joseph. But that's all I know about that. Yeah, I don't really know. What do you all make of that? Why did Matthew put it in here?
I think because it's mystical.
Okay.
And I don't know. Maybe it's one more message from God saying, think this thing over before you do it.
Mhm.
And I mean, Pilate moves forward anyway. The whole scene moves forward. But I'm with Meg. I think it's just an interesting thing there.
Yeah. What that makes me think of, Mary, it reminds me of the very beginning of Matthew's gospel with the Magi. The Magi, who have nothing to do with Judaism, these are Zoroastrians from Persia, but they know what the scoop is because they have their own ways of learning the mind of God. And Pilate's wife, who is a super wealthy Roman citizen, nothing to do with Jews, she has a dream from God. Pilate's asleep, right? He's asleep at the wheel, like we talked about. She tries to wake him up. Hey, don't have anything to do with this guy. He doesn't wake up. But we have this story of him having had the opportunity to wake up. Yeah.
It also may be
Well,
a clear message from God that husbands need to listen to their wives.
Yes.
I was going to say, is this women's rights? It's like, why don't you listen to women? Women found Jesus. You didn't believe. Now you're not believing. I love it. Maybe Matthew was enlightened.
like our presiding bishop says, if it weren't for the women, the men still wouldn't know Jesus was risen. Darren, I see
feel
you're
too-
unmuted.
I also feel like it connects to like that kind of Paulinian ideal of like powers and principalities, like that our big struggle is against institutions so large that there is no conscience. So you have Pilate's wife acting as a voice of conscience and intuition, but because he's got this job in the empire, Pilate doesn't get to exercise his own humanity and do the right thing. He has to do the machines thing.
Yes. Yes, he does the machines thing. He has every opportunity. And she gives him one more. That's really good. That's really good. Yeah.
I actually think Pilate tried.
Well, you know, the Gospels bend over backward in most cases to point out that he tried.
Yeah.
Part of that, too, unfortunately, plays into the anti-Semitic thing in Matthew and John's Gospel, too, by the way, where it tries to make the Romans look so innocent by comparison to the Jewish authorities that you could blame the Jewish authorities for actually crucifying Jesus when it was the Romans who did it. It was a state execution. Yeah.
Well, you know, I spent so many years working in nonprofit, and ostensibly we were there to help people. But over and over again, my heart was broken because we had to turn individuals away because the institution couldn't do that specific thing that specific person needed. And I would go home at night, and the only thing that calmed down my own conscience was this self-talk of, well, I'm just doing my job. I'm just doing my job. But it never fully satisfies.
No, it doesn't.
Like we were still running over people.
Yep.
And it's just this monstrous thing that the machines do. And
yeah,
and I can have a person in my life like Pilate's wife who's like speaking the voice of intuition. She's feeling this whole thing and saying, chill, and like you still can't. You just
right. We don't have a process for that. We don't have a form for that matches. You know, that's outside the scope of our mission statement. Other people do that. I'm over my hours. It's the same in the church.
Sure.
You know, people come to the church looking for help all the time, and we don't offer the specific help they need. That feels awful. Of course, it feels worse to them than it does to those of us who are turning them away. But hopefully we're sending them somewhere helpful. Hopefully, not always. Sometimes there is no place that's helpful. And that's the challenge to the church. And so I want to come back around and finish up. The Great Commission We heard at the beginning, this is what Matthew leaves us with, to go forth into all the world. And what this reminds me of is that the gospel, it isn't just something to know about. It isn't just something to get right or to be correct about. It's not just something to successfully implement in your life so that it then hums along without needing much maintenance. You don't get to just install it and let it run. Like the entire Bible, the gospel is to be wrestled with. And you're Jacob. You're Jacob wrestling with somebody until daybreak. Until the day breaks on the last day, you're Jacob wrestling. And you're going to be wounded by this wrestling match. You're going to have a wound that lasts forever. But you'll come away with a new name. The one who wrestles with God. I think that's our task as human beings. Regardless of our faith, we spend all our time trying to manage the chaos. And God knows we're managing a lot of chaos right now. I talked to a parishioner recently who's just tired of it all, just wants a break, and doesn't want to come to church and hear about more work to do or more references to what's going on in the outside world. Just want to escape all that. Can I just come and be in a place of beauty for a while? Well, that's an oasis, right? Right now, we're missing that oasis big time. Online worship is not the same. And it can't be, because we're not breathing the same air. And I really felt for this person, because I can't provide the thing that the church usually provides. Not the space, not the polyphonic music, not the warm welcome at the door with the bulletin, not the chatter in Seaman Hall at coffee hour. All of that's gone right now. But we do have this. And maybe it's enough. Maybe it's enough just to keep inviting people into this, and when they can't, to make the phone calls, to just check in, to see how people are coping, because sometimes we just have to cope. And maybe this is one of those times. Sometimes the wrestling is just to get to a place where you can breathe for a few minutes. How can we help? How can we, when we have just a little excess energy, not every day, but when we have just a little excess energy, how can we help someone who is running on empty? I think that's all part of the Great Commission, to share this good news, right? God loves you. God has come to be with you. And God is calling on you to make the whole world like that. So I think that's Jesus' charge to us, and I'll stop there. I'll mention that we will start a new series next Wednesday night. And I'm really excited to have been working with Darren to get this series going. And I will share a little about it. It's called A Great Cloud of Witnesses, Ancestor Traditions from Around the World. The details of it are now on the Good Shepherd website as an upcoming event. But I'll share the screen for a moment to show you. There's our little icon of all the saints. The idea here is that this leads up to the Feast of All Saints on November 1st, when we celebrate our ancestors. And so we're going to have a multi-part interfaith series about how we treat what we learn about our ancestors. Now, first of all, on Saturday, we're going to have a special event that will help set the stage for one of these nights. It's an introductory lesson on the doctrine of discovery, taught by the Reverend Rachel Tabor Hamilton. That's going to be at 10 o'clock on Saturday with the Zoom link in the Shepherd's Crook. The idea is to establish a framework for responsible and respectful engagement with other cultures. So I do recommend this, especially in advance of her own talk next Wednesday night. Rachel will talk about death and remembrance traditions of regional indigenous peoples. She pointed out to me that there are hundreds of registered tribes, right? So this sort of pan-Indian idea just doesn't make sense, but she can speak to some traditions. The next Wednesday night, we're going to learn about a Christian tradition, the blending of Mesoamerican ritual and Christianity known as Dia de los Muertos. This is the Mexican observance of All Saints' Day. which has taken on all sorts of things as well. On October 21st, we have Laura Ellis from Sakya Monastery teaching about the elaborate rituals of remembrance observed by Tibetan Buddhists. And then on October 28th, I'm excited about this because I've worked with this man before, Imam Jamal Rahman will talk about the observations and beliefs about the afterlife in Islam. So it is good to do some interfaith stuff. And my experience of interfaith learning is that it always makes me more confident as a Christian in a funny way. Even as I learn of some things in other traditions that maybe I'm a little jealous of, like, oh, wow, you guys have the 5 pillars of Islam and you pray to Mecca 5 times daily. That's some devotion. My gosh, most Christians don't do anything like that. So I learn about these things and then I get more secure in my own tradition. So I want to recommend that. And I also want to recommend our next Sunday series, which will be on the Book of Common Prayer. And I'll share my screen. Actually, I need to flesh this out, don't I? There's not much of a description on the website yet, but it'll be a 4-part introduction to the Book of Common Prayer. And that'll be more especially probably for people who are just finding their way into the Episcopal Church and learning about it. But of course, everybody's welcome. So I want to mention both of those things and invite you.
Well,
Mary.
I'm looking into the Book of Common Prayer more, and like using the prayers for the classes that we did on the church tree.
Yeah.
The prayers, the opening and closing prayers from the Book of Common Prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And it just has a wealth of stuff in it.
Oh, you bet. You bet. If you've never just sat down with a copy of the Book of Common Prayer and just explored, I highly recommend that. You'd be surprised at all the treasures that you find in there. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think with that, we will end the formal class and we will move on to our observance of Compline, speaking of the Book of Common Prayer. So I want to thank all those of you who were watching online or who are watching online in the future. We're glad you could be with us. We hope you learned a lot. Leave something in the comments and we'll answer to that as well. Thanks a lot.